repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes, like poetry. So the question today is, are there rhymes? If we look at the earlier history of Indonesia, particularly the history of Islamization, and what's going on today. So that's the question we're going to ask ourselves. Now, in order to do that, we have to go back and look at the very first evidence of Islamization, and what I'm going to talk about this morning is just Islamization in Java, not in the rest of Indonesia. Although this afternoon I'm giving another lecture, and we're going to look at everything from Sumatra to the Philippines. But today, this morning, just Java. And I'm sitting here because I have to control this machine. Now, with any luck, nothing happened. Hang on, here we go. Now we're getting there. Okay, let's go back to the 14th century. The first evidence of Islamization in Java is the 14th century, and we will try to do this history as quickly as we can because we really want to talk about Islam today. The first evidence are graves found in Java at the grave sites of Krawulan and Traloyo, which begin in the 1360s. The earliest grave was dated 1368. Now, Krawulan and Traloyo have several remarkable graves, which indicate you're talking about a process of cultural transition. One of the issues clearly was, is it possible to be both Javanese and Muslim? Some people said yes, and some people said no. This grave you see on the photograph is actually undated, but it's one of the most remarkable grave sites there, because as you can see, you'll immediately recognize it's an Islamic grave, but the headstone and footstone are Shiva lingas. So here we have Hindu religious objects used for an Islamic gravestone. A fairly remarkable thing. These are some of the graves in situ. What one sees there are the symbolism of a quite distinctive Javanese style of grave, and the symbolism of the sunburst medallion of the kingdom of Majapahit. So these are graves basically at the site of the headquarters of the kingdom of Majapahit, the Kraton of Majapahit, beginning in the 1360s when Majapahit was at its very height, and they are Islamic gravestones. Oops, what's happened? We've jumped to Krawulan. Now, there are two major periods when there are reconciliations of this concept of Islamic identity and Javanese identity. The first was in the time of Sultan Agung in the 1630s. It was a very famous episode when there was a rebellion against Sultan Agung led from the holy grave site at Timbaya, the grave of Sunan Baya. Sultan Agung went on a pilgrimage there, having destroyed the rebellion, of course, crushed everyone, killed everyone. He then went to Timbaya and erected this gateway, which you see in the middle, which is inscribed with the date of his visit, it still stands, and the Sultan's name, in order essentially to incorporate the powers of Islam as a means of supporting the kingdom rather than threatening the kingdom. So the first major reconciliation of Javanese identities and Islamic identities we see in the time of Sultan Agung, and the second, 100 years later, during the time of Pakubuwono II. This is the grave of Ratu Pakubuwono at Nitigan here in Jogja. I remember visiting that grave at Pak Joko. She was a very powerful Sufi figure, a powerful political figure in the court as well, and someone who worked very hard to make sure that the court life and the life of the kingdom was a life of pious Islam. So at that stage you can say that there was no question, there was no issue. Of course, a Javanese was a Muslim. The identities were completely identified. There was no issue of identity at all. And in fact, the kind of Islam we see then by the late 18th, early 19th century is in Islam, which I would describe with the term mystic synthesis. And that has three quite characteristic features. It's Sufism, Islam Sufi. But there are three characteristics. The first is that the sense of Islamic identity was very strong. Now, there were some pockets of non-Muslim Javanese, in Tungar, for example, but mostly to be Javanese was to be a Muslim. It was inconceivable that you could be Javanese and not Muslim. The second pillar of this mystic synthesis was that it appears that the five pillars of the faith, the ritual prayer, the paying of zakat, fasting of Ramadan, and so on, were in fact observed by, as far as we know, most of the population, perhaps all of the population. In other words, that the ritual life of Islam was very widely observed in the late 18th and early 19th century. The third pillar of that mystic synthesis was that also local spiritual forces were accepted. So pious Muslims carrying out the rituals of the faith, yet also accepting the existence of Ratu Kitul, Sunan Lawu, Dangan Desa, spirits in all sorts of ways. Now in the 19th century, that mystic synthesis came under severe strain, and we now begin to see a process by which on the one hand you have Islamization in the sense of a deeper understanding of the faith, a deeper commitment, and on the other, opposition to that Islamization. There were four major social changes in the 19th century. The first was, of course, European colonialism,